All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Zoom room. It is wonderful to see so many, it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and new faces near and far. I see at least one face in California. I see some folks here locally. It's really wonderful to see all of you. Welcome back to boot camp. This is where we kick your butts over Jewish holidays. We all work very hard. We do the difficult spiritual and intellectual work of understanding what our holidays mean and what they can mean to us right now, this year, this season. I am Rabbi Sarah Berman, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Hanukkah boot camp. This year for Hanukkah, Central Synagogue has so much going on, and this is, of course, our very first program. We would love to welcome all of you to share your special Hanukkah moments this year on social media with the hashtag Joy is Central. So if you are on social media, especially Instagram, post a picture of something that brings you joy this holiday season and use that hashtag Joy is Central. You can also mention Central Synagogue in your post. We'll see your post, we'll feature it, we'll amplify it, we will share your joy to bring more light to everybody in our community this year. If you want to know more about what's happening at Central for Hanukkah, please visit our Hanukkah page on our website. Just go to centralsynagogue.org. It will be the first thing you see at the top of the page. Just click through to our Hanukkah site. It might even include one of our special Zoom backgrounds. And despite my pleading and my cajoling, the Zoom background of Joy is Central with my cat is not publicly available. I'm sorry, but I am sharing it and sharing the joy with all of you. Tonight, though, we are doing something so much more important than seeing my floofy on screen. We are learning about the real story of Hanukkah this year. So I would love to introduce to you Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, our speaker. She serves as AJC, the American Jewish Committee's Director of William Petchik Contemporary Jewish Life. She holds a PhD in Jewish history from the University of Maryland at College Park and undergraduate and law degrees from Columbia University. Laura has taught widely, including at Yeshivat Maharat and SAR High School in Riverdale, where she also had administrative roles. In addition to this teaching, she has lectured widely across the country at conferences and synagogues and university Hillels and adult education institutes. She's widely published on subjects including Israel education, Jewish marriage and divorce in America, modern Orthodoxy, and Orthodox women's leadership. Before beginning her work in the Jewish community, Laura was a corporate litigator at the firm of Strouk and Levan LLP. The last introduction I have for you is our wonderful moderator, Abby Pogrebin. She's a former president of Central Synagogue and is the author of 3 books, including My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wondering Jew, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her 18-part series for the foreword, Talking to Clergy About God, which included Dr. Shaw-Frank and our own Rabbi Buchdahl. The series won honorable mentions from the Religious News Association and the American Jewish Press Association. Abby moderates public conversations for the Stryker Center, UJA, the Manhattan JCC, and the Shalom Hartman Institute, and most importantly to all of us tonight, here at Central Synagogue. So I invite us all to buckle up, get ready for Not Your Booby's Hanukkah Story.
Hi, everybody. It's Abby here. I wish we could be together in person, but it is an honor to be with Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank. And before I give her my kudos, because I feel that intensely, she's one of really my heroes as an educator and as a leader right now for the Jewish moment. I want to thank Rabbi Sarah Berman, who is the mastermind behind this series. I want to thank all of you. I see so many of you who are brave enough to come back to boot camp each time. It really feels like the community we've started, and it means a great deal. And a particular shout out to Cantor Dick Botten, who I see is here. It's an honor, and that doesn't mean you're pressured to stay on camera. But Dick, from afar, it's just wonderful to see you, especially before we light candles. You've brought so much light into our world. So Laura, you've let me call you Laura. I hope that's okay, just for efficiency's sake.
Absolutely.
As happy as this holiday is, and I love the hashtag Joy is Central, but we're going to complicate this holiday a little bit more tonight. I want to just start with what I think you know, or at least can posit, most of us grew up with when it comes to the Hanukkah story. Some of us, I'll speak for myself, put on togas, not knowing exactly what Syrian Greeks looked like at our Hanukkah party, and we acted it out with like a pharaoh's hat for Antiochus. It was, very makeshift. But it was kind of, cops and robbers, good guys and bad guys. If I may be so sexist in my language, it was a very clear kind of hero and villain story. So let's just start with what we all were probably taught, whether it was Hebrew school or by our parents.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and especially an honor, of course, to be in conversation with you, Abby. Abby is actually one of my heroes, and I absolutely love every chance I get to learn with her and discuss things like this with her. So I'm so happy to be with all of you today. So, okay, the Hanukkah story. So the story we learned as children was that the Syrian Greeks were in control of the land of Israel, and their evil king Antiochus enacted a law that forbade Jews from practicing their Judaism. And then, of course, Judah Maccabee and his 4 brothers started an uprising against Antiochus, which was miraculously successful. And when the Maccabean army reconquered Jerusalem, they liberated the Holy Temple from the hands of the Greeks, who had defiled it and dedicated it to Zeus and even put a pig in it. And the Maccabees, who wanted to rededicate the temple and light the holy menorah, which had been kept lit all the time, found that there was only one little tiny flask of pure olive oil left to light the menorah, and it would take 8 days to make more for the lamp. But they went ahead and lit the lamp anyway, and miraculously, that little flask of oil lasted for 8 days. And so, in remembrance of this miraculous military victory, which was, of course, helped by God, and the miracle of the oil, the Jews celebrated Hanukkah after that, and continuing till today, by lighting the Chanukah, which is kind of a modern updated Hanukkah version of the menorah, which had 7 branches, and the Chanukah has 8 plus the shamash. So the menorah had 6 plus the shamash, and the Chanukah has 8 to represent the 8 days, plus the shamash, the helper candle. And we would light the Chanukah for 8 days and add celebratory prayers that extol God's hand in bringing about the military victory, and eat all kinds of wonderful foods and celebrate together as families. So that's the narrative that
on one foot. That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. That's like speed Hanukkah. So let's, first of all, I want to just touch on, before we get to the kind of what I think is part of the surprise of the understory here, is to talk about Hanukkah as a redo of Sukkot. It really shocked me to hear that the 8 days of Hanukkah are connected to the 8 days of Sukkot. So can you explain why those are connected?
Sure. So according to the book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, which is one of our main sources for information about the holiday, the Holiday of Sukkot occurred while the Maccabees were fighting against the Syrian Greeks, and therefore they were unable to celebrate it in the temple. And at the time, that Sukkot is one of the harvest holidays. It's one of the 3 pilgrimage holidays in which Jews would bring sacrifices of their harvest to the temple, and those sacrifices would be offered up by the priestly class. And that was not able to happen because the temple was occupied by the Syrian Greeks, and the Jews were busy fighting.
Wait, Laura, was it not also that Judaism, the Jewish practice, had been outlawed?
Absolutely. Right. The temple, not only was the temple occupied, but as we'll get to a little more detail, I'm sure, Antiochus had outlawed, all practice of Judaism. So they couldn't observe Sukkot. So when they finally were able to do so in Kislev 2 months later, they celebrated the holiday of Sukkot, which is 7 days plus Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day. And so they did that.
And that gets very confusing. But the bottom line is that we missed it. So we're going to actually celebrate it now. We're going to do Sukkot now, 2 months or so later. And just to get through again, also our traditional cliches, the fried foods, is that just literally what we think it is, the literal oily foods because of the oil?
Yep, exactly.
Wow. I didn't grow up with the donuts. I feel very donut deprived, by the way.
You know what? It's better to buy the donuts because the smell in the house when you fry things with the oil is just, it's never comes out of the walls. It's awful. My kids have made donuts before. I don't recommend.
You're
Buy.
kind of
Dunkin' Donuts is great.
You're anti-donut. Give us the Hebrew for it because I'm going to mispronounce it.
Sufganiot.
Right, which means, what is
That's
that?
a good question. I'm Sufganiot.
You're an
I'm
Orthodox
wondering if
Jew.
it comes from
I've stumped you.
svog. It might come from svog, which means absorb, which is kind of disgusting.
Okay, that's good. Okay, we won't hold you to it. So let's talk about the one. We're in 167. Am I right? Common Era, and the edict is what exactly? That Jews can't be Jews anymore, or that you can be Jews but you can't do anything Jewish?
Right. So they couldn't kind of outlaw people from being Jews if that's an internal identity, I guess. But hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about that. But they did outlaw all Jewish practice. And this is Antiochus's edict that he, in 167, issues against the people of Judea. And that means you can't observe Shabbat, the Sabbath. You can't keep kosher. You can't circumcise your children. They would destroy Torah scrolls, and they would kill people who were caught observing Jewish practices or Jewish laws. So it was a pretty nasty edict.
And wasn't there something with a pig where they forced either?
Yeah, sometimes they would force people to enact paganist rituals, like by eating pigs or by sacrificing pigs on an altar in some kind of a paganist way. And the fascinating thing is historians don't really fully understand why that edict was issued, because it wasn't a common thing for ancient kings to issue edicts like that. Usually they controlled an area, but they let the population sort of, do their thing and observe the rituals and religious practices that they were used to observing. So that's like an unsure thing in the historical narrative. Historians don't really know what to make of it. And what I've learned, in my studies of Jewish history, is that there's a little bit of an argument about some people actually think that Antiochus may have been mad. He may have been insane. And maybe it came from that, or that maybe there's some kind of a practical reason he did it, whether it's political or ideological or religious, that we just don't fully understand. But it is a bit of a bizarre rule for that period of time.
And the fact that Judah the Maccabee and his little band, we're told it was kind of a David and Goliath story, correct? That they shouldn't have won. They shouldn't have vanquished the enemy when they were so small in number. Is there any historical underpinning that proves that or explains it?
So they were a small group, and it is kind of an interesting thing that they won. So I'll give a few explanations that I understand as to why they won. So the first thing is they engaged in guerrilla warfare, and that's a really interesting thing. They kind of went into the hills, and they could, come down and attack and sneak back up into the hills. And if you think about it, these Seleucid Greeks, these Syrian Greek soldiers, are not indigenous to this area, but Judah, who grew up in the hills of Judea, he is indigenous. He knows every nook and cranny. He and his men know every nook and cranny. So they're intimate with the land, and they're still able to fight, therefore, with that guerrilla warfare. Also, apparently, Judah the Maccabee was a very enticing character. He was a real master motivator who was able to bring others along. Antiochus was a bit of a distracted ruler. He was distracted by battles elsewhere in the kingdom. He wanted to take over Egypt. The Romans were brewing already, and he had other things on his mind. Judah actually was a bit in cahoots with the Romans. He actually signed a mutual defense and neutrality treaty with the Romans. So the Romans didn't help them fight, but at least they didn't, they sort of like pushed back against the Syrian Greeks, and that may have helped. So there's a lot going on there. And of course, as we're going to discuss, Judah the Maccabee was joined by other Jews who helped him in his revolt. So for all those reasons, it still, I would say, is a bit of a miraculous thing. And we can say it's the hand of God, or we can say, if we don't believe in God, it's not the hand of God. It was just a very, very skilled warrior. But he managed to pull it off.
So I think the revelation to me, that was a little bit like the wrong religion, but, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus or there isn't a Santa Claus, was learning that this holiday is very much, and this history is about not just Jew versus Syrian Greek enemy, but Jew versus Jew. That this
Right.
was an internal there was internal discord that actually rose to the level of, I don't know if it was that they were engaged in their own civil war, but there certainly was a kind of internal religious, non-religious tension there, because Judah and the Maccabee were, and I know this is a very simplistic overlay, but essentially the ultra-Orthodox of their time. And there were these Hellenists on the other side that had fallen in love with Greek life and were kind of abandoning the strictures of Judaism. They were watering down their Jewish identity, and Judah and his cohort judged it, didn't like it, and honestly were taking on these Hellenists as much as they were taking on the anti-Semites. So can you kind of have I oversimplified this?
Not maybe in some little ways, but let me complicate it a little bit. So
you don't want to hurt my feelings.
Never. So here's what I would say. I'm going to actually call the Maccabees modern Orthodox and another group ultra Orthodox. So let's step back for a second. So when Hellenism took over, when the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE takes over sort of the world as it was known at the time, then it divides into kind of sub-Greek empires. They brought along Hellenism with them. Now, Hellenism is this very enticing culture. You could think of it a little bit like American culture is today. The people who lived under Hellenistic rule learned to speak Greek, but it wasn't just about Greek speech and being governed by a Greek government. They also their eyes were open to this new Greek culture, the culture of the gymnasium, the culture of Greek philosophy, the culture of Greek debate, and all these things that were very exciting in the ancient world. So Judea, the land of Israel, when it was taken over by the Greeks, Jews actually Hellenized. So we could call the word Hellenized kind of like acculturated, and we can unpack a little bit about what that means. They continue to be Jews, they continue to practice as Jews, but they kind of liked the notion of some of the Greek practices. They liked the gymnasium. They liked to go sort of battle in the gymnasium. They took Greek names, much as the way, you have a nice Jewish name. My name is actually Greek, Laura. So much as the way today we name our children American names, not, well.
Before you leave the gymnasium, and this is not just prurient interest, they were naked when they were competing. Yes. Am I right? And yes. Wasn't there something about circumcision being an issue there?
Yes, there is definitely something about circumcision. So as Jews become very enamored of Hellenist society, there are moments in which that Hellenist acculturation sort of slips into assimilation, right? So if acculturation is kind of retaining your own identity, but taking on certain cultural elements of the culture around you, assimilation is kind of erasing your identity in favor of the culture around you. So yes, there were Jewish men who would go naked to the gymnasium and were embarrassed about their circumcisions. And actually they sought, there was some procedure that had been created in Egypt, I don't know what it was, I don't want to know, that reversed the circumcision, and they would try to kind of like make their genitalia look uncircumcised in order to look like this perfect kind of Greek emblematic body. Like, the Statue of David, or like these other, things that we think of as being Greek art. So all that to say, it's not so simple, right, to say like these, and Antiochus comes in with this rule against observing Judaism, and all of a sudden the Jews rise up and fight. There actually were lots of Jews that were kind of on board with this Hellenism thing. This is particularly urban Jews, particularly wealthy Jews, particularly Jews who were around living near the temple. Even the priests were Hellenized. And it's kind of like the country, what they thought of as the country bumpkins, the Maccabees, who were living out in Yedemsveld, who were kind of old-fashioned and backwards and traditional. They were the non-Hellenizers. There was a group that I'm going to call the ultra-Orthodox. They're the most like the ultra-Orthodox today, and I'm going to explain in a second why I say the Maccabees are the modern Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox, I'm going to say, even though of course that's anachronistic, were a group called the Hasidim, the pious ones. Now, not the Hasidim of today. That's an innovation of the 18th century in Poland, so not those Hasidim. but Hasidim in the sense they were pietists. They were very, very against Hellenism. So they were opposing all of this, gymnasium stuff, all these naming Greek names, all this Greek spoken language, all of that. And they really were pushing back against it the whole time. The Maccabees, I would say, are maybe modern Orthodox in the sense that while they didn't Hellenize, they actually did incorporate certain notions of modernity into the way they interacted with the world, which is kind of fascinating. And I'll give you one example, which I think is so interesting. They fought on Shabbat. They fought against the Syrian Greeks and against the Hellenizers on Shabbat. The Hasidim refused to do that initially. And the Maccabees were like, look, we can either give in to breaking Shabbat to save our lives, or we can just die and let Judaism die. And they were kind of able to understand that moment. And some historians think that that may have been somewhat because some Greek philosophy had sort of entered the notions that they had, their worldview, in a way that they were able to kind of make that negotiation.
Fascinating. So even if, and I was joking about my being simplistic, even though I'm perfectly happy to own it, there are many very erudite Orthodox Jews, as you know, who have used this story to prove a point. And they have said, at least when I was interviewing several from my book, Hanukkah is a warning. This is what Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who is the giant of the Talmud, for those who don't know, he translated it for 40 years. He recently passed in the last couple of years. I was lucky enough to actually interview him when he was on one of his rare trips from Israel. Very tiny man, and at that point, very whispery voice. So he actually had to have someone translating, even though he was speaking in English. But he was pretty unapologetic and unequivocal about the fact that Hanukkah is a warning. Those were the words he used. It's a warning to what can happen to the Jewish people when they let their differentness, their difference, kind of go away, be compromised. As you're saying, acculturation slips very dangerously, and this is in his perspective, into assimilation, and suddenly we're not Jews anymore. So his language was that the Maccabean revolt was fought by Jews to remain Jews. And when I talked to one of your colleagues, I don't know if you know him personally, historian Seth Cohen at Columbia, he really blanched or he resisted this. He said, this is a narrative that is used for someone's, not for someone's, for a certain kind of mindset, for the purposes of those who want to say, beware of assimilation. But I just want to not reject it right away and kind of explore it a little bit, because we're living in a time where we do see kind of Jews judging Jews, where those of us who are at Central Synagogue, I know you're in the modern Orthodox world, and we can characterize, or you can characterize that for yourself, because I don't think it's as simplistic as that label. But for those of us, 3,500 family, 6,000 Jews and 2,700 families at Central, when we see the language sometimes of the Rabbinut and that Reform Jews are not real Jews, I mean, it brings back, for me at least, this Hanukkah story of deciding that we are essentially the Hellenists of this time, that we're sliding, that we're letting something get watered down. So that's a long way of saying, help us without, giving us Jewish therapy. Maybe I'm speaking from my own kind of frustration with those labels. Some of what we see play out between those groups who say you are not Jewish enough.
So here's what I'm going to say. If I had to distill my entire Jewish history education of so many years into one sentence, it would be, Jews have always taken in elements of the external culture around them and have always strived to maintain their Judaism. Meaning, we've always been taking on the outside culture. I'll give you an example that I always use when I talk about this, which is the Seder, which today we think of as being this intrinsically Jewish event that is so Jewish. We talk about the fact that Jews like to ask questions and answer. We talk about all the symbols being so intrinsically Jewish. Guess what? The Seder is Greek. The word afikomen is Greek. So we have taken in external culture forever, going all the way back, and we still do that today. Now, That doesn't mean that we agree on how much external culture we should take in. I would say that the ultra-Orthodox world would say modernity is dangerous. We need to close the door and keep it out in any way that we can. It's very tough to do that when there are cell phones and internet, but okay. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, there are Jews who say, I'm kind of done with this particularistic notion of Judaism. I'm not really interested in that at all. And I just want to assimilate into general American society. But everyone between those two extremes, ranging from the centrist Orthodox to Reform, are struggling to find that place. What is that place in which we say, okay, this much is enough to take in, this much is too much, this is dangerous, this is safe, this is too fast, this is too slow, etc. And I think that it really behooves us to know that and to notice that, because once you realize that everyone, like the vast majority of Jews, between those two poles that I talked about, are engaging in that activity, it becomes much less about you're not Jewish and you are, or whatever, and more about you're making different choices about how much modernity is appropriate to bring in and how much is a bridge too far. And we can debate that until the cows come home, because there's a lot to debate there, a lot. But that's what we're talking about, really. That's what the debate is. I do want to say it's super important for us not to just let in everything and not to water down Judaism to a point where it's so bland that it is indistinguishable from Unitarian Christianity. Right? We don't want to do that, because then we have lost our particularism. We have lost.
So I want to actually, you've just led me to where I wanted to go, which is that I'm now going to argue with myself and say that I sometimes feel like, let's not lose the Hebrew. Let's not lose the idea of strictures, the idea of whether or not some of us are not going to live the way some like you do, with just more of a sense of what the mitzvot are and adhering to it. I also worry that sometimes we're allowing things to slip. And I guess one of the things that we each wrestle with, as you said, personally, is in our own families and for ourselves, it's just how much are we adhering to something that we essentially learn and follow, even if the world is pushing against it. So one of the images that I think is the most moving about this holiday is the idea that you're supposed to put the menorah in the window. It's not enough to light it. You're actually supposed to expose it. It's supposed to be, I think, in the doorway. In Israel, it's in every doorway, but for those of us in apartment buildings, and how powerful it is to kind of announce your difference in that way. It's Pirsum Hanes, publicizing the miracle. I would love you to just talk about that commandment in the context that it was first originated, and then even today, why we, particularly now when some people feel like it is perilous to wear a kippah or a Star of David, why we should essentially be publicizing the miracle, putting that menorah in the window.
Sure, absolutely. So the rabbis came up with the notion of Pirsum Nisa, or Pirsum Hanes, one Aramaic, one Hebrew. And yes, that's exactly the notion, that we're supposed to light the menorah in the window, the Chanukah in the window, or in Jerusalem and Israel, or specifically in Jerusalem, but even all over Israel, they put them in these glass boxes, literally like outside the door, as you were saying, which is so amazing. So we're supposed to show that we are thanking God for this miracle of the oil, the miracle of the military victory, etc., and therefore show it off to the world. And of course, it has such a different valence in a diaspora country than it does in Israel, where in Israel, it's a very widely kept holiday, as it is in America as well among Jews. But it's not like there's nothing dangerous or making oneself vulnerable by putting a menorah out of your house in Israel. Of course, in America, and particularly in this moment that we're in, that feels uncomfortable, that feels a little bit fragile because of rising anti-Semitism, it might feel a little bizarre to put that Chanukah in the window. But I think it's actually such a perfect metaphor for right now. I think we should all be putting that Chanukah in the window with such pride, because we're saying, this is who we are. We are just putting ourselves out there. Take it or leave it. We are particularistic. We are not observing Christmas. We're observing Hanukkah. This year they don't overlap, but we're observing Hanukkah. We're putting our Chanukiah in the window and we're saying, here we are, world. What are you going to do with us? Are you going to put out our flames, or are you going to accept us for who we are? And I think that the message in America is they're going to accept us for who we are. I'm not underplaying what's going on with anti-Semitism. And I'm hoping to God that we're not going to have any anti-Semitic events surrounding Hanukkah. But I do love that image of us being defiantly particularistic and proud in this moment.
Me too.
And of course, light, right? It's, light is such a
Yes.
beautiful metaphor for that too.
So I think we're all so moved by light. I want to talk about the Hillel versus Shamai argument about how to light the Hanukkah, because I think that there's symbolism in each of their arguments. Can you summarize?
Sure. So Hillel and Shamai, these rabbinic figures that are sort of known for arguing with each other, and their students are known for arguing with each other, sort of the emblem of the Jewish rabbinic argument. So like in every area, they disagreed about how to light the Chanukiah. Shammai said you should start with the 8 candles and diminish each day 1 more candle. So you're kind of showing, you're really reenacting the moment of the temple. You're reenacting the fact that the oil's running out, it's running out, but it makes it to the end. So there's something that's very beautiful about that sustaining of that light all the way to the end. And Hillel says, no. You take the first night is the first candle, the second night is 2, 3, 4. And of course, that's the way we practice today. In general, we practice according to Hillel. We add a candle each night. And for Hillel, that adding of the candles showed that every day the miracle was even greater, because we would expect that it would have gone out days ago. And in fact, each day, the light of the miracle is even more powerful and even more miraculous. So I personally also like watching the lights get stronger and stronger as the days get shorter and shorter in December, and just feels like this natural way of lighting up the winter darkness.
And I don't want to put you on the spot. I always forget. We're supposed to add the candles left to right and light them right to left, or the opposite? Do we light them the way we read Hebrew?
Yes, you put them in from left to right and you light the day. So the way you can remember it is you light the day of the candle. Like if it's the 4th day of Hanukkah, you light the 4th candle first.
And then you light it in backwards, or
right.
as
4, 3, 2, 1, and then the shamash gets put away.
It's a great way of remembering it. Thank you. Before we leave this idea that we hold on to things that never change, you just talked about how the Seder was Greek, like with these assumptions that things were handed down on Sinai and have not moved. One of the things that it was, I think Michal Springer, Rabbi Springer, who was in charge of pastoral education at JTS, was saying to me that it's also kind of a misapprehension that we have not evolved. We've evolved on many things, including Hanukkah, that there used to not be a commandment to light the menorah on Hanukkah, and now there is. That was essentially invented by the rabbis. So where is the mitzvah when it comes to this holiday? Where do we find it? And without, maybe you don't have the exact date, but roughly what's the era where it suddenly is required?
Right. So it's in the Mishnah and the Gemara. So rabbinic Judaism, let's say 200 to 600 CE, something like that. So a few hundred years after the Maccabees. And the rabbis ask, my Hanukkah, what is Hanukkah? And they go through all the conversations that they have between Hillel and Shammai in the Mishnah, and then explaining it through rabbis in the Gemara, how exactly we're supposed to observe Hanukkah, how we're supposed to light the menorah, what oils are appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the rabbinic era. So it's a long time after the holiday.
And also, I think it's surprising, and I want to remind everyone to please put your questions in chat, because I'm going to go to them pretty soon. And I would love whatever's on your mind or your comments. I know that I was shocked to learn, I keep talking about my surprises, but this is part of what I love about this holiday, is that it really has so many more layers than I knew, that the legend of the enduring oil appears in Jewish sources about Hanukkah many centuries after the Maccabean revolt took place. So I know that some historians posit that this oil legend was literally a fabrication. That sounds derogatory. I don't mean it to be. A fiction, though, that was invented by the rabbis to kind of sort of soften the militaristic message in this Hanukkah story. Can you just give us a sense of the evolution of this oil legend?
Sure. So we don't know for sure that the oil legend didn't somehow last from the time of the Maccabees to the time of the rabbinic Judaism when it finally comes out in the Mishnah in the Gemara, right? We don't know that it didn't exist. I will just say that it's possible that the Maccabees don't like that message of God interfering. They want it to be all about them, right? So maybe they left it out of the narrative. But most historians do believe that it doesn't actually surface at all until it comes up in the Talmud. And the rabbis, they saw the Maccabees as sort of complicated figures in many ways. So after the Maccabees won and retook Jerusalem, they actually were governors of Judea. Judea became independent again until the Romans take over in 63 CE. So the Maccabees become the Hezmonian dynasty. You may have heard of the Hezmonian dynasty. Hashmonai in Hebrew, they're from their village outside of Modi'in. And the Hezmonian dynasty wasn't always so great. First of all, while they did do some things to kind of return Judea to its more Jewish self, they used Hebrew on their coins. They, of course, brought the temple back to Jewish practice, etc. But they were Hellenized themselves. They spoke Greek. They did also have Greek coins. They had the gymnasiums. They also really embraced Hellenization in some ways. There was one of them that was called Phil Helene, which means, of course, loves Hellenism. So the rabbis don't love them as figures who exemplify what it meant to them to be a good Jew. So they don't like to valorize. They didn't want to valorize them in that way. And they wanted to sort of diminish the notion of the military victory and bring it back to God. Bring it back to religious practice, bring it back to a miracle. They also cast the military victory, by the way, is very much, of course, an intervention of God, right? It was God's hand that guided the Maccabees to success. So that's kind of like where the oil comes in. And it's very interesting because we think of the two as being very much hand in hand, but in fact, it's really hundreds of years later that the story of the oil comes in.
And that mirrors kind of the evolution of the holiday in Israel. You and I talked about that a little bit before. David Hartman, who's kind of a legendary educator who's since gone, but talked about how when he moved to Israel, he saw this holiday in a very different way. How do these dynamics of the militaristic kind of, the strength of Jewish might versus the miracle of what God did to save us, how does that play out in the Holy Land?
So it's so interesting. When we lived in Israel, our children were very little. We had two little kids at that time, and they were both in nursery school. And I remember the holiday being so much about dressing up like Maccabees and having fake swords made out of tinfoil. And even when they sang about the light, there's this song called Banu Choshech Legaresh, which means we've come to exile the darkness. And it's like a marching song. I'm not going to sing it for you, but it's like a marching song that sounds very militaristic, and it's all about banishing darkness and every person being their own light, and together the light makes a big strong light. So even in the story of the light, there's sort of like a militaristic aspect to it. But if you think about it, it makes total sense. The Maccabees are this little tiny ragtag band that manages to hold off and defeat this empire that's seeking to control their land. It's not so hard to see why that is very much resonant for Israelis who see their own history going back to 1948 as being this ragtag band of Jews from Eastern Europe, from Holocaust survivors, from wherever, who somehow managed to eke out a victory from Arab armies in the War of Independence. And, we can complicate the history of that and all that, but that's not for tonight. But you can see how that is a very resonant image, fighting for the Jewish soul, for the Jewish people, for Jewish independence against an army that seeks to destroy that.
And it is a story that I think we've told I'll speak for myself. I was told, and I tell my children, that is a moment of real kind of Jewish pride in endurance against the odds. And I don't want to take that. Someone once said to me after my books, like, you're yucking my yums on Hanukkah. You're kind of like, you're taking away just the pleasure of just the joy, not the joy, but the pride in this story. I don't mean to do that at all. I think what is interesting, and I think important for us to talk to our older kids, because I have kids in my 20s now, is part of what they've experienced on campus, what they're experiencing as young people on social media, that there is a bit of a sense of in some, the Jewish story being under siege in some way, and kind of the few against the majority. We're going to go to questions in a second. I just want to go to Christmas, because everyone I spoke to about this was pointing out that this was a pretty minor holiday. It is not even in the Torah. I think a lot of Jews don't even realize that. And yet it's become kind of the counter Christmas, and how that evolved, just as a historian watching the Americanization, as some say, of Hanukkah.
Sure. So this is fascinating. There's actually a whole book written about this by Diane Ashton, who's a great historian. So America in the 19th century takes on this sort of domestic culture. I don't know if any of you remember this from college courses or whatever, but this notion of the hearth and home as being this place where we act out our values and our religion and our gender values and all of our nationalistic values, that we act them out at home. And Christmas becomes this home holiday. It's of course still a church holiday as well, but there's all these notions of, you put on the Christmas tree and you have candles in your windows and you have presents under the tree, et cetera, et cetera. So as Jews are coming to America and trying to acculturate into the American milieu, the rabbis are very concerned, and this is particularly Reform rabbis in the late 19th century, who are concerned that their flock is going to start just going to Christmas, because it's so much a part of this domestic culture in America. So they kind of domesticate Hanukkah and make Hanukkah also into this holiday that is about hearth and home, about materialism, and about family. And so it's at that time that we start moving away from these notions of Hanukkah Geld, which was the way Jews celebrated Hanukkah in Europe, by giving some money to their children, particularly in Eastern Europe, that then some of that money would go to charity, et cetera, and sort of embracing this wholehearted, materialistic American notion of holiday gift giving. And, decorating one's home and inviting people in for parties and serving the traditional holiday foods. All of that was sort of part of that domesticated nature of holidays in America. And, I guess the obvious thing is they're at the same time of year, right? We don't domesticate the other Jewish holidays like that. And you're right, Hanukkah is a minor holiday. It's a rabbinic holiday. It's not in the Bible. It doesn't have the significance of Shmini Atzeret, how many American Jews observe Shmini Atzeret, right? But so many American Jews observe Hanukkah.
Such a high point.
Right. Hanukkah's near
No,
Christmas.
but I remember the year that Christmas and Hanukkah were concurrent, the Chrismukkah year, or that where there was also the same with Thanksgiving. Someone's asking, and this kind of gets to what we were just talking about in terms of the gift giving. When did Hanukkah become the gift-giving holiday instead of Purim? I feel like a lot of Jews don't realize we're supposed to be giving gifts and bringing food and those things to people who are neighbors or in need. So in a way, it also has outweighed Purim in terms of a gift-giving holiday. Do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. Yeah. So this is fascinating. So when Eastern European Jews came to this country in large numbers, as we know, in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were very eager to sort of show their upward mobility. They embraced American materialism a lot. And there's been a lot written about how they sort of embraced shopping, buying American clothing, American furniture, pianos, all kinds of things. And one of the things that they adopted was gift giving, because gift giving sort of showed their upward mobility. And of course, it mirrored what their Christian neighbors were doing on Christmas. Whereas poor Purim was kind of, in the middle of March or February, when there were no Christian holidays. So it kind of got lost as Jews acculturated and assimilated. One interesting thing that people did on Purim, they had Purim balls in the 19th century. And they sort of had fundraising balls. That's a whole other story. We can talk about that on Purim. But yes, we kind of got away from the traditional notions of gift giving on Purim because there wasn't a Christian parallel. And so the gift giving sort of flipped to when Christians were giving gifts, which was Christmas.
Someone is asking, and I have been gently reminded that I think I misspoke and said 167 CE. I should have said it's before
BCE.
the Common Era. So
and I missed
don't want to
that.
miss.
Sorry. Yes, BCE.
Okay. I stand corrected. Why doesn't the Book of Maccabees get canonized?
Good question. So it's after the canonization of the Bible, which happens under Ezra and Nehemiah. It's too late. It's too late.
But explain just how that, I know that you know kind of what it means to be canonized or not. Give us a little bit of a.
So there is a decision process that happens, and we really don't know a whole lot about that decision process. Well, let me just say this. According to Jewish tradition, Orthodox Jewish tradition, the Bible was given in its current form on Mount Sinai. Okay, so I just want to say that because that's the sort of traditional response that you're going to get in the Orthodox community. Historians don't agree with that answer. And they say that the books were written at different times by different people. You can even have their Orthodox Jews who say some books were written, not the Bible book, not the Torah books, but the other books were written by people later. But at some point, according to historians, all those books were compiled into what we now know as the Bible. So it's made up of three parts: Tanakh, the Taf for Torah, the Nun for prophets, Nevi'im, and the Kaf for Ketuvim, or writings, where we have like the Megillah from Purim, the Megillah from Tisha B'Av, various other Megillot. It's not actually a Megillah from Tisha B'Av, but Eicha, etc. And that canonization of the Torah took place earlier in time, before 167 BCE. And therefore, once the books of Maccabees were written, and there are two books of Maccabees, at least one of them, by the way, was written in Greek, which Hellenization. By the time those books were written, the Bible was closed. It was already decided that this is the Bible as it stands, and we're not adding anything to it. And by the way, and I'm not sure about this, so I'm just going to put this out there, but I'm not sure this is actually true. It could be already that, like, because there's this notion that the Torah was given in its entirety, the Bible is given in its entirety on Mount Sinai, right? That once we get to 167 BC and they have the Bibles already canonized, they're like, no, we can't add anything to this because it was given on Mount Sinai the way it is.
Fascinating. Are there other sources that confirm the Hanukkah story aside from the Book of Maccabees? And I would just add anything archaeological.
Yeah. So, so the Book of Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, Roman, confirms the holiday as well. He calls it a holiday of light, interestingly, which we don't really know 100% what he means by that. And he kind of talks about it in the language of religious freedom in a way that like almost is evocative of America. Like it's kind of crazy because he lived such a long time ago. There are also coins from the Hezmone dynasty that archaeologists in Israel have found, including coins with Hebrew. And this is so cool. The Hebrew coins sometimes have a picture of a lulav on them. And the lulav, of course, is one of the things that we use to observe on Sukkot. It's the palm frond that we shake on Sukkot. And of course, as we discussed earlier, Hanukkah was a kind of observance of Sukkot a little bit late. So the fact that the Maccabees put that lulav on their coins is kind of like, yeah, that's amazing. There have been other archaeological finds that confirm the Hezmone dynasty as being, what it was. And that's, as far as I know, what we know. We have the books of Maccabees, we have Josephus, and we have archaeological evidence of the Hezmone dynasty. What I don't know, I should know and I don't know, but I'm a modernist, so you'll have to excuse me, is whether there's Greek evidence of Hanukkah. That I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't, because nobody likes to report when they lose a war, right? Bury that.
In terms of the Hasmonean dynasty actually not being a particularly successful story of leadership, is that something that sort of gets buried as we recount? Because this is such a heroic story that they won, and that we don't take anything away from that, but they didn't really know what to do with power once they had it, it sounds like.
Yeah, one of the big mistakes they made is they controlled the temple they made themselves their dynasty into the high priests, but they were also the rulers. So they sort of conflated, they mixed up religious control and state control. And as we know, even in today's times, Iran, for example, that gets very messy and very difficult very quickly. So that caused some corruption, particularly in the temple, and may have weakened the structures to the extent that Romans were then able to come in and take over. And the Roman takeover of Judea is kind of like a passive takeover. It almost like happens by the by. They sort of sneak their way in because the Hezmonians are infighting and sort of corrupt and weak. So it's kind of sad that this is, I mean, before the current state of Israel, the Hezmonian dynasty is the last time that the Jews had their own rulership, their own state in Israel. And we do look upon it like, I actually think that Netanyahu may have once said, they ruled for 70 years or whatever. I don't remember what he said. They ruled for some period of time, 100 years. We have to get past that point. Like we have to get to the point where we're ruling for longer than the Maccabees, because then, we've made it.
Wow.
So I don't think that people really talk so much about the corruption of the Hezmonian dynasty. If you walk the streets of Jerusalem, there are streets named after a lot of the Hezmonian kings. Shlom Tzion Hamalka, near the old city. So
maybe they're going to have some of that revisiting, like we are revisiting our monuments and statues now.
Exactly.
Someone's asking, was this the first moment of division within the ancient Jewish community? That kind of Jew versus Jew tension?
No, I would say that's in the Bible. Korach, even like, it's still in Egypt. I would say Jews are always good at fighting with one another. And hopefully what we have to hope for is to fight with each other out of love and l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, and not for the sake of tearing each other down, but really for the sake of the greater good. But the notion of internecine conflict is an old one in Jewish life.
And can you talk about just I think it's interesting, the rules around lighting the menorah and Shabbat candles when they fall on the same day?
Yeah, so there's always a Shabbat Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is 8 days. So there's definitely going to be a Shabbat Hanukkah every year. So the Hanukkah candles need to burn for a certain period of time, like let's say at least half an hour they need to burn. The problem is that you have to light Hanukkah candles after dark, so after stars come out in the sky. So the issue is that on Shabbat, we light candles an hour before dark. And therefore, the Hanukkah candles have to last for a super long time to make sure they last into that period of time where the stars are out in the sky. So you have to use super big candles on Friday. Sometimes we use those anyway. People light oil, that oil lasts for a number of hours anyway, but you have to make sure that those candles are going to last. And also we always light the Hanukkah candles first before the Shabbat candles, because once we light the Shabbat candles, it's Shabbat. And so according to traditional Jewish law, we wouldn't be permitted to kindle a flame. So we light the Hanukkah candles first, and then we light the Shabbat candles, and then the Hanukkah candles have to last into the night.
Thank you. Why don't we raise up this real story today? Someone is asking, the way we do the miracle of the oil.
Okay, so holidays are as much about the story, I don't want to say story, they're as much about the greater truth that we're trying to tell as they are about the factual truth that we're trying to tell. And we know that from American holidays too, from all holidays. Holidays are so much about a lesson, a narrative that we have either inherited or have created or have shaped over the course of millennia, or at least hundreds of years. And I would say that those narratives are actually beautiful and important, even if they're not always 100% factual, because they're teaching us something. I mean, Hanukkah is teaching us so many beautiful lessons about the importance of standing up proudly and embracing at least somewhat particularistic Jewish identity, and not totally assimilating. It's a holiday about light. It's a holiday about acknowledging the miracles that we see in the world. It's a holiday about Jews triumphing and having a land of their own. There's so much in it to embrace, even once we complicate the story, the narrative that we've inherited with facts. So I would encourage us to kind of look at the big reasons that may be kind of ideological, rather than just get lost in the facts.
You know, it reminds me of also studied facts. That's from a historian. Don't forget the facts.
Yeah.
I remember Rabbi David Wolpe, you know, he's given a million sermons, but the one that was the most controversial was when he said that the Exodus story is not documented. There's no historic proof. And he said, he always says, no one finished the quote, which is, and it doesn't matter. The
Right.
Passover story is central to who we are. It is central to our narrative. It is central to kind of how we see ourselves in the world. And it's not about documenting exactly whether that happened or not.
Can I say something about that?
Yes, I was going to finish, but yes, you have the last word.
One of my favorite lines ever. Jonathan Safran Foer wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times about his Haggadah. He talks about reading his son a story about Moses not dying before he goes into the land of Israel, whatever. And his son says to him, "Daddy, was Moses a real person?" Best line ever. Jonathan Safran Foer says, "I don't know, but we're related to him."
I love that. That's the perfect ending.
Yep.
Thank you, Laura. Dr. Laura Shaw Frank of AJC. I hope you all make sure you have a chance to learn with her and read her. She really is, I think, just a leading light right now. Speaking of lights, I want to thank again Dr. Sarah Berman, or Rabbi, I'm forgetting my monikers here, who has just been a wonderful partner through this, and her team. Nicole Auerbach, obviously, is head of adult engagement, and my senior rabbi, Angela Buchdahl, and all of her team. It's just such a pleasure that I've been given this opportunity to have these conversations, and my community. A shout out to all of you and those who are not members of Central who have joined us today. I hope you'll stick with us, because it's going to be a thrilling year of exposing things you never knew about the tent poles of our tradition. And we will send you the next date. But in the meantime, it's the Sunday after Thanksgiving that you are lighting the first candle. Make sure you do that hashtag Joy Central. I was asked to promote it, and I think it's wonderful. So let's get back to connecting that way as well. So I'm wishing you all just the sweetest Hanukkah, very oily and very crispy latkes. I am very pro sour cream and very anti applesauce. Just saying, that's a whole Talmudic debate. We can have another time. Goodbye, everybody. And thanks again, Laura.